All right, class. So talking about the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Um, First thing, hold on. So the change in partial pressure, understanding the change in partial pressure is really important to understand the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Okay. Now, in this, let's look at the graph here. On the x-axis, we have partial pressure of oxygen, and on the y-axis, we have percent oxyhemoglobin saturation. Do you remember what is oxyhemoglobin? It's oxygen bound to hemoglobin. And remember, 4 oxygen molecules can bind to 1 hemoglobin. Okay. Now, one thing. The higher partial pressure of oxygen does not cause much change to the oxygen saturation level of hemoglobin. What does that mean? I want you to look at the x-axis first. At the x-axis, you do see 100, right? So when the partial pressure of oxygen is 100 millimeter of mercury, at that point, look at percent oxygen saturation. So at that point, the percent So at PO2 of 100, the percent saturation is about 97.5%. Okay. So when partial pressure of oxygen is 100, which is here written, the oxyhemoglobin saturation is 97.5%. We get this. Now let's look at the point where the partial pressure of oxygen is 40. So let's look here. At this point, what is the percent of oxyhemoglobin saturation? It's about 75%. Do you see that? So it's about 75%. So what do we see from here? We do see that at higher partial pressure of oxygen, we don't have much change in saturation level. So let's take a look at 80. If you look at 80, it's still about, I would say 96% or so, 95 or 96%, right? So see, when you are 100%, for 100% partial pressure of oxygen, the percent saturation is 97.5. For 80, it's not changing much. Do you see that? It's about 95%. And we get this S-shaped or sigmoid curve. However, let's look at lower partial pressure. So let's say we look at, so at 40, we have 75%, right? So let's move down to 20. At 20, we have about 30 to 35% oxygen. Do you see how big of a difference we see from 40 to 20? From 100 to 80, there wasn't much difference. However, as we move from 40 to 20, there is this huge difference. At 40, we had 75% oxyhemoglobin saturation, but at 20, we have 30%. Why is that? Why is that? The reason is, please hear me, lower the partial pressure of oxygen, lesser affinity of oxygen to hemoglobin. So, lower the partial pressure, meaning at 20, 15, 10 partial pressure of mercury. So lower the partial pressure, lesser affinity of oxygen to hemoglobin. Therefore, at lower partial pressure, oxygen tries to fall off. Okay, it just detaches, it just falls off the hemoglobin molecule. Therefore, small changes at lower partial pressure lead to large changes in hemoglobin saturation. I want you to understand this. So, small changes at lower partial pressure from 40 to 20, that actually leads to large changes in hemoglobin saturation from 75 to 30. Hope that is clear. All right, now there are different factors that can actually affect the percent saturation of the oxygen hemoglobin curve. These two are pH and temperature. Now, so at the center, we see this line is the actual sigmoid curve, right? And then let me see if I can change color. No, it's not letting me. And then when it shifts to the right, do you see how the curve can shift to the right? So when the curve is shift to the right, first thing you must remember is that there is reduced oxygen hemoglobin affinity. And this is really common when the blood reaches the tissues, because in the tissues, remember, what do we need? In the tissues, the RBC has to dump off the oxygen to the tissue cells, right? So lower affinity is good for the tissues. Therefore, we see this in the tissue where there is reduced affinity of oxygen hemoglobin molecule. So at that point, if you just look at 40 partial pressure, let's take a look here. At 40, what is the saturation level like? It's about 50% saturated. Do you agree? So reduced oxygen saturation because of reduced affinity for oxygen. So at 40, it's the saturation is 50%. If I go back, when the curve was normal, at 40, the saturation was 75%. Do you see the difference? Okay. Now, this reduced, why do we have this reduced affinity? This reduced affinity can be caused by increase in carbon dioxide concentration or decrease in pH or increase in temperature. You must remember these factors for testing purpose. Now, the curve can also shift to the left, right, this way. And when it shifts to the left, then that indicates that there is increased oxygen hemoglobin affinity. So let's look at the same point, 40. Look at the saturation level. It's about 85%. Okay, so when the curve shifts to the left, there is increased hemoglobin oxygen affinity. So at partial pressure of 40, the saturation level is 85%. And this is caused by decrease in carbon dioxide concentration and increase in pH and decrease in temperature. All right, so I'll stop here and then continue with, I'll make another video on acid-base balance.